our speaker, is, somebody who always inspires me. And so when I say I'm grateful to have the opportunity to hear what she's got to share. And so here is Rita Conrad.
So I turned my microphone on. Oh, good. It's good. And it's not squeaking, which is always wonderful. I have to say that, first of all, thank you, Jan and Nina. Thank you for writing that beautiful song. Thank you for the violin. Every time you play the violin, I go somewhere else. It's marvelous. And I have to say that this is probably the most nerve-wracking of talks I've ever given, because my son is right there. And we got him to church by saying, today is your birthday. They'll sing happy birthday to you at church if you come. And then when he got here, I said, and now you got to listen to mom for 20 minutes. But he's a good sport. He'll probably be the loudest heckler of y'all, so don't chime in. So, good morning. Per the Christian calendar, we have now entered the Lenten season. We are now preparing for Easter. And in our house, when I was growing up, Easter was always a very special time. Waiting for the daffodils and the tulips to peek out from under the snow. Watching mom sew the beautiful Easter dress she would always make me every year. And of course, waiting for the surprises that the Easter bunny would bring and trying to catch him before he put those baskets out in the morning. But on the more serious side, like many of you who were raised in a Christian church, I was taught and believed from the time I was a young child in catechism that in the final moments of his life on that Good Friday before Easter, it was written that Jesus Christ uttered these words, my God, why have you forsaken me? Powerful words and desperate words, sad and defeated words. To me as a young child, I just couldn't wrap my head around it. Why had God left Jesus in that moment when he needed him most? I didn't get it. Jesus had done everything his father had asked. Why would a parent abandon his child or her child in those moments when they were needed most? Not only did those words confuse me, but they also set the expectation that when I would need God the most, God would leave me to figure it out for myself. And sure enough, that time came. And ironically, it was the morning of Good Friday of 1967. Good Friday, the day that Christians usually reflect upon the final moments and hours and death of Jesus. It was on that morning that we laid my father to rest. And I will tell you that in my 11-year-old brain, those words screamed, why have you forsaken me? And I wasn't talking about my dad. I was talking about the God out there. And in those days, God was out there to me. And in that time, right now, it was very convenient to blame that God for what had happened. That belief that God had forsaken me set in motion a life of separation. A life of saying to God, you abandoned me, I'm going to abandon you. I was a child of God, but a very immature child of God. And I also set up my separation from other people, because if God was going to forsake me, well, heavens, mere mortals were going to do the same. And I pushed everyone as far away as I could for about 20 years. I believed that I would get to the end of my life and pass from it still forsaken. I believed my dad had been forsaken in his final hours. I lived recklessly in my young adulthood, and I hadn't a clue why I was here, nor did I really care, nor did I ask myself why I was here. I measured the quality of my life on what I did for a living, what I had acquired and owned, what other people said about me. I didn't consider purpose to be any deeper than those things. Fortunately, 2 decades after all this had occurred, I read page 92 of Eric Butterworth's book, Discover the Power Within You. And on that page, Eric Butterworth talks about those final words of Jesus' life as translated by an Aramaic scholar, Dr. George Lamsa. Dr. Lamsa was a native Aramaic speaker, and in 1933, he published the book, The Holy Bible from Ancient Eastern Manuscripts. And in that book, he writes that per his translation and his understanding of what had been written about those final words, Jesus had actually said, my God, for this was I kept." Not at all words of despair, but of triumph, with clarity, complete certitude, that feeling complete in all that had transpired in his life. So then when he said, "It is finished," he was saying, okay, great, I can go on. And Butterworth went on to write, Jesus certainly could have said in that moment, I don't have to take this. But instead, he was saying with his last breath, this is part of the great purpose of my quest to overcome death itself and prove the principle of the divinity of man. He could have tried to run away from his purpose. And in fact, certainly the night before in the Garden of Gethsemane, he asked 3 times, please let this go on to someone else. It can't possibly be mine, please. But it did not pass from him because it was his to do. When I read those words in Butterworth, "For this was I kept," they made much more sense to me than what I had been taught those last words were. Even though I have never been able to find those words in any version of a Bible, those are the ones that resonate with me. And I thought, that's what I want to feel in the final hours of my life when I leave this world. To know that the things I've done, whether or not I knew it at the time, they made complete sense now in that last moment. That they were all part of the entire reason I was here. I wasn't just passing through with no connection and no purpose. What I did mattered in a way that I might not have understood in any particular moment, but it was important that I did it. For this was I kept, were the words I could build a life on. It reinforced to me that scene that we all know so well from the movie It's a Wonderful Life. We talk about It's a Wonderful Life all the time, where George Bailey wishes he'd never been born. We know it well. And his guardian angel Clarence says, okay, fine, I'll show you what it'll be like for other people. You think you're going to be so blessed by not being here. Think about the other people whose life will be bleak because you're not here. And at one point, George is standing over the grave of his brother Harry, and he's screaming at Clarence, this is all a lie. My brother's a war hero. He saved all these men. And Clarence, just trying to get through to him, says, all those men died because Harry wasn't there to save them, because you weren't there to save Harry. And then Clarence utters those profound lines, strange, isn't it? Each man's life touches so many other lives. And when he isn't around, he leaves an awful hole. And she does too if she's not around. Each of us is kept for something. As Jim Rosemergy writes in The Quest for Meaning, we all dance with this question, why? Why am I here? And I find as I'm aging, I ask, why am I still here? Some mornings when I get out of bed. Some of us may have reached that stage in our lives and we're beginning to think, oh, there's nothing much I can do at this point. I mean, if I haven't accomplished my purpose, it's too late. Or perhaps we think, my greatest work is already done. I'm finished. I don't have enough energy to do anything else. But here's a hint, just a suggestion from me to you. Consider regarding your purpose that if you're still here, you're not done. Either you're not done evolving or you're not done helping someone else evolve, or both. A prime example of this came from watching my mother in her wisdom years. In her mid-80s, my mom, who was living alone and had lived alone since my dad died when she was in her 40s, fell in the middle of the night and she broke her arm and her hip and laid there that night till the next day when my brother and sister came to visit. And to make matters even more challenging, when she was recuperating from the surgery of this, she fell again and she broke the other arm. Now, don't feel too, Mom is not one to sink into any kind of, she would sit in bed laughing and she was fine, But it was clear to all of us that she was going to be going home from the hospital to a residence home and not ever go back home again to her home. And she'd also be in a memory care unit, what is now called a memory care unit. Those days, it was a dementia unit, because she had been living several years with dementia. And people would say to me things like, well, my goodness, Helen has been through so much. Why doesn't God call her home? And I'd just chuckle a little bit and I'd say, well, I don't think Mom's done yet. Maybe there are people in the residence home that need her. I thought perhaps she would help her fellow residents in some way. But we found out on the day she was transitioning that what had transpired over the 9 years she lived there was something completely different. Staff members dropped by that day to tell us how much she had changed their lives. One of the male nurses said, if they only could all be like Helen. He said she'd always smile and thank us, even if all we did was bring her a glass of water. She'd be there. And another staff member said, sometimes, some days the only reason I came to work because Helen was there. So my mom lived out her purpose in a place where society thinks we are sent to wither. And I know without a doubt that she was kept for those staff members. But my mom is not an anomaly. I collect people who are living with gusto, way, way past you and I. By this standard, none of us here are old. My friend Charlie, who in his 80s produced an Emmy-nominated documentary on the Japanese internment camps. This was in his mid-80s, and he went on then to see that the book that followed the documentary was published. And then he oversaw the writing of the play that was produced by the Houston Repertory Theater. No grass grew there. But there have been many centenarians that I've studied whose messages have guided my life. How can we forget George Burns, who lived to 100, and in his 90s said, I'm not going to have time to write another book here because when I'm 100, I'm over at the London Palladium doing a show. So don't bother me when I'm 100. There's another person who you may not know, but her name is Iris Apfel. And she is an icon in the fashion world. But she calls herself the geriatric starlet because it wasn't until her mid-80s that she actually had a show done on her work. In fact, she said her nephew was standing in back of someone who was saying, I have no idea who this woman is. She must be dead. And She said, next time you're in back of a person like that, you just say, my aunt is very much alive and well. She's walking around to save funeral expenses. Iris is alive and well at 101 today. So, and then there was Jerry Brilhart, a spiritual teacher at Unity of Brentwood in Northern California. And her last publication was My 100 Years in the Rhythm and Flow. And she lived to be 101. But the one who takes the cake is the one that came last week. This is a new book, just out last week. And it's about Sister Jean Dolores Schmidt. And many of you may not know her unless you are an NCAA basketball fan. Yeah, you know who Sister Jean is, Rita. The title of her book is very appropriate for this talk, Wake Up with Purpose, in which she writes, it took me 98 years to become an overnight sensation. It surprised her to have fans from all around the world because, as she said, I've lived an ordinary life in an ordinary way. But in 2018, at age 98, Sister Jean was the team chaplain of the Loyola University men's basketball team. And it's March Madness time for all those who watch basketball. You know I love football, but basketball is my second love. And that team was a Cinderella team. Sister Jean projected maybe they'd make it to the Sweet 16, and they made it to the Final Four, which is right before the finals, for all of those of you who don't know basketball. So people around the world were convinced it was because of Sister Jean, who would pray the team in and hug them out after the game. And one team member pointed out that he thought that when she prayed them in, she was going to do a simple, regular old Catholic prayer. And he said, and instead, she started coaching us and giving us a scouting report right in the middle of it. Sister Jean is 103 and going strong. And she's still the chaplain of the Loyola University men's basketball team and a student mentor. Several years ago, she was asked to set the team motto, and it remains the same today. Worship, work, win. In reading these memoirs, I found that none of these people wrote about agonizing over what their purpose was. They simply seemed to know it, to find it, by listening to the voice within them. As Greg Lavoie writes in Callings, we shouldn't spend so much time waiting big booming voices from above that we stumble over the whispers that are right in front of us, right at our feet. Our purpose is in those whispers. Our purpose lies in our connection, not only to the source of our being and all love, but to one another. Which is why these words from the author, Parker Palmer, who I know I probably overquote, but I adore. He's one of my wisdom guides. He wrote that it might be better off to get away from the question, what is my purpose, and think about who am I serving? And that our purpose will unfold naturally from the answer to that question. Because purpose, we know, is never self-serving. It manifests through service to others. And as I listen to the answers to that question for me, I have complete faith that at the very end of this existence, I'll know exactly why I've been here. There are already hints as I look back over how my life has unfolded. And certainly the big hint is you. It's often said that we shouldn't look back because too often we do it with regret or guilt or sorrow or anger. But it's okay to look back in appreciation of seeing how your understanding of truth and purpose has unfolded. Looking at the good you have already done and embracing it. As Sister Jean says, everybody needs a pat on the back, including ourselves. Every night I look back on the day at the good things I have done. It makes me excited to wake up the next day. Although she says, follows that by saying, but every day I wake up is a good day. So look back on your life, realize those points not only where others made a difference for you, but you made a difference for them, because that's where your purpose was. That's where your gifts were used. Remember that and carry that forward into purpose today. There is something for which you and I have been kept. And the realization of the whole picture may not come until that last breath. But you have glimpses of it even now as you look back and honestly see the events that could not have happened without you. The people you have impacted and the ripple effect of those who they in turn have impacted. If you're still here, you're not done. Ask yourself, who am I serving? Listen for the answer, and you will find that for which you have been kept. And so it is.